Just by the mere thought of me answering this question, feels like I'm poking one of Kraid's orifices with a spear. As in, my subjections have preemptively caused the spike-producing organ readying up to impale me through the wall at speeds impossible to react, knowing that a select majority would assert themselves otherwise on why this aspect shouldn't be classified as the weakest, because they fulfilled an admission to its general structure. But trust me, I have my reasons for it. Barring the soundtrack striking itself out and utterly failing to hit the standard several times, excluding the Diamond in the Rough Berenia, of course, I personally vouch toward casting my vote against the level design as Metroid Dread's lesser admired trait, as an act of lecturing for it constantly annoying me. Alluding to my recent rant on Gavarin's asinine approach as a wasteful gimmick, this is where it resumes for what remains. In fact, I'll be brutally honest. Metroid Dread's level design is inherently responsible for losing quite a bit of replay value for me. That's not necessarily stating me absolutely hating it per se, but it's enough to be annoying in my opinion. Before I get to the details on why, I'll provide some nitpicks first and foremost. Generally speaking, there's always been unique forms of immersion when it comes to the fundamental basis of exploration in a Metroid game, courtesy to its level design, some being greater than others. Areas are usually built as an invitation for the player to deliver that excellent feeling of adventure flowing through them once they first enter inside, and after a while, start to build a relationship to that area once all the elements are absorbed. Metroid Dread sadly ignores this crucial factor and instead decides to make the initial formula of exploration almost completely obsolete in favor of several maze-like hallways and passages molded together to such a degree where it ultimately chokes the environment. Thus, only a puzzle remains inside an illusion of an area. Point being, there's more room for gimmicks and less space for immersion, if at all, because of how nearly everything is squeezed so close together that there's nothing interesting left in the area to admire. At the same time, however, it mostly works in the game's concept for portraying Samus as the victim all the while until she morphs into the predator because, to be fair, this is a game that keeps you down in a state of vulnerability, but even with the positive side of the game's structure, it's still a huge letdown that almost every area on the map is like this. If it didn't limit the amount of space to move around in, then I'd appreciate the entirety of ZDR more, because none of the areas in Metroid Dread outside of one held anything memorable, disregarding the role to the story. Atmospherically, I guess they're somewhat decent, but that's as much credit I can give it honestly. But again, these are just nitpicks. Dissatisfaction is set at a neutral rate for my views. Nonetheless, the gimmicks functions perfectly and cohesively as intended. On the other hand though, I really cannot say the same for its ridiculous quantity. I don't understand the need on why Mercury Steam had to include at least one gimmick for each power-up. Because if you ask me, having that mindset for the sake of level design is a tad bit on the over-ambitious side of things. Especially when you consider certain segments in the game having multiple kinds of them meshed together in the same room for progression instead of saving the innovations later for item collecting, which subjectively would have been far more ideal than what was constantly offered without pause. And since there's so many, there's bound to be uncomfortable notions regarding Metroid's common criticism. Now, I'm usually not one to adhere to the infamous credential everyone knows and loves as linearity in a Metroid game, except other M, because personally, I always found it somewhat intriguing as a game design philosophy, depending on what it did to handle the game's primary objective. Fusion obviously burns bridges to create the omniscient nature behind the X-Parasites, therefore limiting the player's options and forcing them to follow the directions given to them in the most brilliant way possible just to add tension. The classic return of Samus takes the descending layer of acid as its own form of linearity to clearly convey an incomplete objective and uses every area as a checklist for the player to fill in, and progress will be enabled, indicated by the tremors. Both cases are linear, but it also works in the game's favor because it's logical. What isn't logical is Other M's oh so glorious idea of linearity by strong-arming and restricting the player to move through one gigantic straight path with fucking pathetic excuses for save stations set as end goals for the entire game. It doesn't and shouldn't work like that at all, because the end result is mind-numbing tedium. Back to Metroid Dread. At least it's not anything to complete a resume for bad level design or anything. Far from it. If anything, it's more so confusing on why the level design is quite literally all over the place, to the point where the game can't make up its mind half the time. Especially for the concept of escaping with your life. I don't understand why the path to your ship has to be so stupidly specific and complex by default. Sequence breaking helps to an extent, but the problem still remains that you're still following the same path regardless if you exploit something to obtain an early power-up. And call this a hot take if you will, but there's just something about sequence breaking in Metroid Dread that I found to be kind of empty for how it was handled in general. You don't actually carve a different path or make things go by shorter after receiving a utility enhancement earlier than intended, like how the procedure normally goes, because you're still left with the same original linear path the game gives you, thanks to certain passageways being blocked off by something else that you're missing. So it's like, what's the point other than to show off? I don't know, the more I did the various sequence breaks in Metroid Dread, the more I noticed how inconvenient it actually was half the time. Despite the entertainment factor they performed, it barely provided any benefit due to its high encouragement for strict navigation routes. But I digress. Perhaps Gavarin has been tickling my brainstem a little too hard for me to come up with rational complaints that won't justify the event of my gored body being pinned to the nearest wall because of Dread's general concept for level design leaving unpreferred tastes in my mouth. But the point is, I just don't like how everything is laid out on the map of the planet. However, the real nail on the coffin concerning what I mentioned earlier about the area's almost complete absence for the concept of exploration are the Emmy zones. More times than not, you're spending more time wandering around these dangerous hallways than having that grand satisfaction of adventure from the new world outside of them. It's mainly the reason why I love Berenia so much, because the lack of an Emmy zone gives the environment a chance to breathe for once and ultimately invites a player, unlike the rest. It just goes to show that this game would be better without the Emmy zones and let everything be set free to make it feel like you're exploring a planet filled with dread. That's exactly what Fusion did. Sadly, not so much here. Let's make this explanation more clear, just so that no one opposes me all defensive-like because they disagree. The runner-up for my least favorite aspect in Dread is the level design because 1. The layout is too complex and linear. 2. It focuses too much on gimmicks. The basic blocks are fine. 3. I'm not a fan of the closed-in passages and would prefer it if they were more movement-oriented and open, mainly the space jump because it barely got a chance to shine at all. 4. Sequence breaking strangely hinders more than helps. Apart from glitches like pseudo wave beam and underwater bomb jump, it's really not by a whole lot. 5. The Emmy zones kill too much of what makes the areas interesting. 6. The areas themselves are designed by how they work than how they feel, which subjectively isn't my preference in this series. So why didn't I choose a soundtrack over this of all things, you might ask? Well, the answer will be too obvious, first of all, and quite frankly, I don't want to be a part of that broken record. Despite the issues I have with Dread's level design, it still works extremely well as intended. It's simply just not my kind of thing to revisit. I know that I'm not supposed to have any room to breathe, but this is honestly ridiculous.